Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 16 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by actual FBI cases. In this episode, I interview retired Assistant Special Agent in Charge, John Cosenza. Now, John served in the FBI for 22 years and spent most of his career working counterterrorism cases and extraterritorial jurisdiction investigations. John explains that extraterritorial jurisdiction authorizes the FBI to investigate crimes against Americans that occur on foreign soil when the crimes, such as murder and kidnapping, are based on an act of terrorism. These extraterritorial jurisdiction cases took John all around the world to numerous countries and international venues. John talks about one counterterrorism case in particular involving a Tunisian operative and a European terrorist cell. He worked this case while he was assigned as the Assistant Legal Attaché, ALAT, in Italy. The case was worked out of Milan, Italy, and was unique in that it was worked jointly between the FBI and the Italian National Police with assistance from NCIS. The successful investigation resulted in charges of conspiracy, arms and explosive trafficking, and the use of fraudulent documents. We'll get to that interview in just a moment. I just want to again thank everyone for their continued support of this podcast. I am absolutely enjoying the tweets and the emails that I'm receiving on a daily basis from listeners. Keep them coming. And also, please continue to sign up for my newsletter. Thank you for doing that. And here's the interview. Hi, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to introduce you to my guest today, John Cosenza. Hi, John.
Hi, Jerry. Thanks for having me on.
Now, I know you've had a varied career, very exciting career, but you have selected a special case to talk about today. Can you give us a little tease? What are we going to be talking about?
Sure, Jerry. I was assigned as an ALAT in the Legal Attaché's office in Rome, and we had a case that was brought to us from our New York office with some vague information of a Tunisian who was traveling to Italy to meet up with another group, which turned out to be a decent-sized cell in Italy. And they had plans to attack an American installation. So we were able to work jointly with the Italian National Police on the case, and it had some good results, a lot of work and some good results.
Oh, I can't wait to talk about that. But before we get into the case, tell us a little bit more about you. What were you doing before you joined the FBI, and when did you join the FBI?
Okay. I was when I got out of college, I was a sales rep, a factory rep for about 4 or 5 years. It was a childhood dream to be an FBI agent, and I had gone to graduate school while I was working at Federal Express, and I got into the sales program, entry level with Federal Express. And the whole time I was kind of working my way towards applying to the Bureau, and then I had the opportunity to do that. And I actually started in February of 1991 with the Bureau, and I went, back then it was 4 months in Quantico. And so I got out in June of 91, and I was sent to the Tyson's Corner RA in Virginia, which is now in Manassas. It's Tyson's Corner isn't there anymore. And I started off on a drug squad, which was a lot of fun, especially for a new agent getting out and doing a lot of work. And then I worked. Everybody made a rotation through the background squads. We did background investigations. I did the DOJ. There was in Washington, or assigned to either DOJ or the White House. And so I had the Department of Justice. So I did that for about a year. Got some good experience. It was it gets you out there to talk to a lot of people doing interviews. About a year, I was transferred into the Washington field office, which at the time was in Buzzards Point in D.C. And the first squad I worked on was a state-sponsored terrorism squad, which I really had a lot of fun doing, and it was really good work. The state-sponsor squad was unique in that only a few offices in the Bureau worked both counterterrorism criminal cases and counterintelligence cases on the same squad. And they had an invisible wall, and you couldn't cross over the wall at that time. So you had to separate the cases, but you got to work both of them, which was interesting and a lot of fun. From there, I went to a Middle East terrorism squad and worked Hamas cases. Hamas at the time was kind of a fledgling organization, but they had a lot of support and structure in the United States. So I worked Hamas cases and had a lot of good work. And on that squad I worked extraterritorial investigations. So any time Americans are assaulted, kidnapped, killed overseas, the FBI can work the cases either with the locals or through assistance with Washington. So
could you give us an example, a couple of examples of those type of cases? Is that where there's an American at a club in Germany when the club gets blown up?
Anytime an American overseas is murdered, violently assaulted, kidnapped, as an act of terrorism, then there's extraterritorial squads in the Bureau that work the cases. Most of the ones I worked the first couple of years were in Israel. I think I made 13 TDY trips to Israel to investigate Americans that were injured or killed. At the time, Hamas was setting bombs off in buses frequently, and there were a large number of American victims. So we would go over there. We did a ton of interviews because we could interview any American citizens by ourselves, which we did, and of course shared all that information with the Israelis, and they allowed us to assist in certain matters of the case pretty frequently. Any assistance we could provide, we would provide, and we would get briefings. We would try to add intelligence to their investigation and work the cases hard. Most of the Israeli cases, arrests were made, or we found out later that the victims were killed, the subjects were killed during fighting. But at that time, that was probably the biggest one. It seemed like, pretty frequently we were headed over there. Kobo Towers, when there were 19 American Air Force personnel killed in the bombing of the dormitory, we worked with the Saudis for months on the investigation to try to track down the subjects of the bombers. So that's the extraterritorial investigation. So
and in the case of the recent attacks in Paris and in Brussels, then any Americans that would have been unfortunately killed in those instances, there are also agents on this extraterritorial squad who would be working to investigate their deaths.
Right. Either any assistance at all that we could give to the French, or other countries working hand in hand at times. Depending on the level of cooperation that's needed.
Well, that's pretty interesting. I know I wasn't aware of that, so I would assume that many of the people listening were not aware of that activity. I was assuming that the American embassy would contact the family in the United States and say, we're sorry to report that this has happened, and that's the end of it. But there is an actual investigation as best as we can. Absolutely. To get as much information to the family as possible.
At the very least, a parallel investigation to try to assist the lead police force or agency, or run an investigation on our own, as far as we can, and provide as much information as possible. At times it goes beyond that, where we'll find a subject that has fled one country into another, and we'll go to the third country and the fourth country, and then however long it takes. Some of the arrests have been made in extraterritorial cases. We had one at WFO. The arrest was made 12 years after the attack, and it sends a message that the U.S. government's not going to forget.
I mean that's a bit of valuable information that you're sharing with me and the listeners here. It makes me proud, to know that we take that extra step to make sure answers are brought back, our people answer to the killing of Americans, even if it is overseas.
Right, absolutely. I worked on the Hamas squad for about 3 or 4 years, and then actually transferred over to the extraterritorial squad, which was all extraterritorial cases. And at the time, they were worked at Washington, Miami, or Los Angeles. And From there, I went to counterterrorism division at headquarters and worked the same investigations in Middle East unit and the extraterritorial cases from 98 till 2000, about 2.5 years. And in 2000, I went to the legal attaché's office in Rome as an ALAT. I had the counterterrorism and counterintelligence programs. And I was in Italy for 4 years and enjoyed it. Italians were professional and a first-rate organization, the Italian National Police, and really had some good relations and enjoyed it. I came back, lucky enough to get back to Philadelphia in 2004. And I was on the Philadelphia Joint Terrorism Task Force for a total of 4 years, the old Squad 17. And then I went to the Gang Task Force for 2 years and ended up, had the opportunity to work as the criminal ASAC in Philadelphia for the last 2.5 years or so. And I retired in the end of 2013.
Now, let me ask you, when you were in Italy, do you speak Italian?
When I was a child, Italian was spoken in the house, but I really didn't pick much of it up. So the Bureau sent me to language school before I went to Italy. So I went from headquarters to language school for about 3 months. And then when I got to Italy, continued every morning, continued the lessons for about the first year and a half.
And how did you do? Did you get proficient?
The Bureau and the State Department test you on a scale of 1 to 4. And when I got there, I tested as a 2 with both the State Department and the Bureau. And I felt confident in meetings. I certainly wasn't as good as other people in the embassy. And the Italians are very gracious. If you didn't understand something or needed some help, they were always willing to give it to you. So they were good that way, good group.
Fantastic. Okay, so are you ready to talk to us about that case?
Sure. So this goes back in the early fall of 2000. Our office in New York, the New York field office, sent us a lead and provided information that a male using the alias Umar al-Muhajir was joining a group of 3 Islamic extremists that were already in Italy. And they had vague plans to conduct attacks against an unknown American target in Italy. So, the information looked pretty good. We didn't have a lot of it, but they did send a phone number. And we ran the phone number in Italy, and it came back to a man named Hasid Sami Ben Kamayas. Kamayas was a Tunisian. We had some information pretty quickly that he was a member of the Tunisian combatant group in Tunisia. And so we went to the Italian National Police and requested a meeting, and we shared this information with the INP, and you could tell right away that they were interested, and they asked us to wait a few minutes, and they called a number of investigators into the conference room and provided us a sketch of an ongoing investigation that they had regarding the same subject, Sami Ben Kamayas.
Oh, wow. What a coincidence.
Yeah, it was actually pretty good timing, and they had a number of associates already semi-identified. And they had a code name, which was Al-Muhajirun, which stuck around for the whole investigation. And this was the early stages of their investigation.
Is there a particular significance to that code name?
It means the immigrants. And they had all left Tunisia and North Africa and ended up in Italy. So that was where the name came from originally. Kamayas, he came to Milan in 1998 with a man named Abdelkader Es-Said. Es-Said was also associated with the Tunisian combatant group. He brought Kamayas to Italy to be his recruiter and to be his document man. They had a large-scale operation throughout Europe at the time in document forgery. And so in July 2000, probably about 6 weeks before we were involved with the Italians before a meeting, Kamayas' apartment was raided during an INP investigation into immigrant smuggling. And during the search of his apartment, the police found a photocopy of a Yemeni passport belonging to a subject that they knew pretty well. His name was Al-Sakaf. Al-Sakaf was later arrested in Jordan for having ties to the Mujahideen in Chechnya. And this is the beginning. A lot of these guys that we ended up running into throughout Europe and through all the legates in Europe all were significant players. So he was the first one. And so this started the INP investigation into Kamayas. So we began sharing details, and for us mainly background information on Kamais, and we got a lot of information from the Italians. And pretty quickly we learned that he had spent close to 2 years on and off at training camps in Afghanistan, mainly for logistics. He was a document forger and a recruiter. That was his shtick.
So he wasn't necessarily there for any type of training, fighting.
Not that we were aware of at the time, Jerry. That's a good question, because some of that will come up later. So he was associated with S. Said, and S. Said's job was to recruit and send fighters to first Chechnya, and then later on Afghanistan. So we started to get a little bit more information that Kamais wasn't just a forger, but a pretty accomplished one. And so later, probably mid-fall of 2000, the FBI director at the time, Director Free, was visiting Italy and meeting with the Italian National Police Director, Gianni Di Gennaro. And so we requested Director Free to ask Director Di Gennaro if we could have access into the case and possibly work it jointly. At the same time, the Italian National Police agents that we were working with requested the same from Director Di Gennaro. So at their level, they decided that we could work together and that we could actually work the case jointly. So,
what's the significance to that? Because I know that I've talked to other LEGATs and ALATs that have worked for the FBI as a representative overseas, and most of the time it's a liaison position.
Right. That's most of the time it's a liaison position. The difference here was that we were actually Joe Genovese and I were deputized into the Italian National Police for this one specific case. It was case specific, but because we were deputized, it gave us direct access to the INP investigative material, and vice versa. So we truly worked the case jointly. They had the lead, of course, over there, and Joe Genovese, who was the legat, Joe was a really experienced guy. He had originally worked with the Italians during the Judge Falcone assassination by the mafia and spent a lot of time over there and worked hand in hand with the Italians during both the Falcone and the Borsellino murders, two Italian judges. So again, this gave us direct access to the investigative material. So Joe and I traveled up to Milan and Varese province, soon about 25 minutes outside of Milan, where Kamais lived. And that's the first time we met the DIGOS investigators that we were going to work with. And DIGOS is the Special Investigations Division of the Italian National Police that work a lot of their high-level cases, CT cases, OC cases up north. And we also met the prosecutor, who was a really interesting guy, Stefano D'Ambrosio. Stefano was very talented and accomplished prosecutor and had a ton of experience. And in fact, every time we met him, he was with a team of bodyguards because of the cases he had worked previously and threats that were made against him. But a very aggressive guy. We found Kamais owned a small cleaning business, which we found generated just about no income. And later we searched, his apartment was searched, and there were no business records and very little equipment, so we knew that was pretty much a front. And about that time, we found that the Italians had a number of very well-placed listening devices that would become really important later on in the investigation, but they were really well-placed and were providing good information right from the start that we were able to generate a number of leads at the beginning. And one of them led to the location of a safe house in Varese. I think it was in the town of Gallerate, which would become important to the investigation as we went forward. So at this point, on our end, what we were doing, we had brought the agents from New York in and gave the Italians a full brief of everything that we had. We were doing a lot.
How many agents from New York were coming in? They were coming to assist you with this matter?
Yeah, originally 2, and then they would switch out. And then as we got going, we had TDYers from a number of different field offices. We had TDYers from headquarters and a ton of TDYers or temporary duty assistants for language, for translations, for analytical help. And then, of course, investigators as well. So we ended up having a big group there. In fact, at one point we needed help, and we went to NCIS, who had a spin-off investigation into this group Lou Cosentino was the attaché, and he provided us with a bunch of really good Navy translators as well. So we got a lot of help at the beginning and all through the investigation, really. So at this point, we're just doing a good deal of basic investigative work, assisting the INP, identifying subjects who had ties or connections to the group, determining what their ties were, if they had any, and what the different roles were. And we were trying to wrap as many people as we could into the investigation so we could start working backwards into their background and who, what, where they were. And the Bureau at the time were also providing a lot of technical help through equipment, and at the time some high-tech equipment, which really helped out as well. So at that point we found out that Kamayas was actually convicted in Tunisia, convicted in absentia in Tunisia and sentenced to 10 years. He received a 10-year sentence, but he fled before he was arrested.
What was he convicted for?
Association with a terrorist group.
Oh, well, that's significant.
Yeah, so that was significant, and that got a little bit more attention. And at the same time, and this really got us going in the right direction, we started to get a lot of information from the telephone overhears from the Italians that Kamayas was in both telephonic and physical contact with cells all over Europe, in Germany, in Spain, in the UK, in Belgium, in France, and he was talking to these guys all the time. And so whoever he would talk to, we would try to identify. And then he began physically traveling through Europe to meet these guys, and it led to a number of really good surveillances. But one of the contacts that he met was from the UK. His name was Abu Doha, and we knew of Abu Doha because his name was found in the on a guy named Ahmed Rassam, who was arrested coming over the Canadian border into Washington State by a very alert customs agent who just noticed the guy was a little nervous, something wasn't right. They pulled him over, they opened his trunk, and he had a whole trunk load full of explosives. Down the road, through investigation, the Bureau determined that the target was LAX on the millennium, on New Year's Eve of '99.
Wow. And that's something, I don't know, has that been made public before?
Yes. Rassam was arrested and convicted, and some of this information, including Abu Doha, was actually used at trial when this group went to trial as background. And so we know Kamayas was in direct contact with a number of other cells, and we were sharing the information throughout Europe with our legal attachés. And at the same time, the Italians were sharing the same information through the European police forces. So it was a pretty good system because our legates would then contact the police departments and vice versa. And so we really had a large group looking into some of the same information. So it worked out good. It filled a lot of gaps. We had a ton of gaps to begin with. And with help from the legates and the European police departments, we were able to start filling the gaps.
And John, do you think the fact that he was looking at American targets in Italy, was because the group was frustrated that they were unable to get into the U.S. to target Americans? Yeah,
Jerry, that had come up, and it could very well be true, especially Rassam arrested at the border like that with a plan, a planned attack in the U.S. And, because of a very alert customs official kind of was thwarted. So it very well could be they went to Europe. So we were doing a little bit more surveillances, and then one of which became pretty significant. Kamayas left Italy, and he went through, I think, first Lyon, France, and then Paris, France, and into Pamplona, Spain, and eventually, Valencia, Spain, where the meeting was held. And a number of European police departments really worked well, and this surveillance went through probably 5 or 6 countries, but our guy ended up going through Italy, France, and Spain. And at this meeting were all the heads of the cells in Europe, including Doha, including a number of others that we'll touch on as we go here. Kamayas, the Spanish police lost Kamayas after the meeting, but were able to place him with a number of these cell leaders in Europe, one of which was the French police identified Kamayas as having met with a French subject who at the time we knew as Meliani. And Meliani was implicated in a planned attack on the Christmas market in Strasbourg, France. And what happened is the German police raided an apartment less than a week before the attack was planned, and in a briefcase found all kind of information on maps of the market, ways in and out of the market. That was the target, was the market, and it was the first kind of thwarted attack at that time, but it came close. The French police said, look, this was within a couple of days of actually going off. And so we identified Meliani as actually Mohammed Ben Zakaria, and he'll come up again down the road here. So at this point, we're working pretty well with the INP. The New York office was great. They were sending investigators on a regular basis, TDY agents. We had analysts, linguists, legates were helping us out. We were running everything we had through other U.S. government databases for intel. And at that time, it was about to get a little busier. We were able to develop access to a human source, which became a big part of the investigation. And it wasn't the biggest part, but they were in a position to provide identifications. They generated a ton of leads, and it really started to fill more gaps, which is what we were trying to do. So we're trying to narrow the group down so we could identify everybody.
Oh, that's key. Absolutely key to have a human source like that.
Yeah, that was a big part, and they did a great job. Kamais's main location in the city of Milan was the Islamic Cultural Center. The ICI was later, after this investigation, was closed down by the Italians. But at the time, it was kind of the centerpiece in Milan for Kamais and his group. They would go in there and some days not come out for 2 or 3 days. They'd be in the ICI overnight, 2-3 days. Sometimes they come in 4, 5, 6 times a day. The ICI, which was good at the time, was under constant surveillance. We had some good human source coverage.
And the ICI again? I'm
sorry, the Islamic Cultural Institute.
Okay.
And actually, the former director of the ICA was a man named Anwar Shaban. So he was an Egyptian who was killed in fighting in Bosnia in the mid to late 90s. And at the time, the Milan prosecutors called the ICI a substantial crossroads for Egyptian terrorists in Milan, and later kind of morphed into more North African. But it was a hot spot.
Now, is this a religious institution? And if it is in Italy, are there certain privileges or
yes, it was
sanctuary that you have to be careful about? Absolutely,
Jerry. It was an Islamic cultural center, the ICI, and there was study groups, prayer sessions. There was a mosque inside, so they were protected by Italian law. So that was a little bit of an obstacle. So once they went in there, it was kind of a safe haven for them. And again, after this investigation, the Italians shut it down because there was enough information as to what was going on inside the institute at that time. But at the time that we were investigating, that it was kind of a safe haven, and they used it as such. So we were continuing to receive a lot of fragmented information, bits and pieces here and there from a number of different sources, that a group who at the time we hadn't identified, but we thought Kamais was involved with it, was planning an attack on the embassy, or we even got some information that there might be an attack on the embassy water supply in Rome. And, it was bits and pieces coming in from all over. So we had a little bit here and a little bit there. Later, intel and investigation did determine Kamais was involved in some of this planning, and that information was used at trial down the road. So all this information's coming in, and in early January 5th of 2001, the U.S. Embassy in Rome and the U.S. Embassy in the Vatican, the Holy See, and a number of the consulates were shut down due to credible threat information. And what really tipped it over the edge was at the same time, a wall was discovered altered in the 2,000-year-old Roman tunnels that surround the embassy. There's a whole other Roman city beneath the modern-day city, and the city of Rome inspects the tunnels on a regular basis. And
for security reasons or for infrastructure reasons, or both?
For both.
Okay.
And that's a good point, because the engineer that was down there saw a hole that he thought was a newly punched hole in a 2,000-year-old stone wall. And that was enough to, shut the embassy down based on all the other information that was coming in. So the State Department, through the regional security officer, the RSO, implemented immediate safety measures and got extra security in. And we had an FBI TD Wire from Philadelphia, actually, at the time, who was helping us work the case, volunteered to go down into the tunnels with the city workers and the INP. And he went down into the tunnels for about an hour and 15 minutes, took pictures and, diagrammed a little bit. They were able to relocate the hole and determine that it was recently, knocked through. And at about the same time, I think within a couple of days of the embassy being shut, the German police arrested the cell that was in Germany. And the cell was led by the man that we knew as Meliani, who was Mohammed Zakaria. And so after the arrest, within an hour or two, we picked up an overhear from Germany to Camayas stating something to the effect that they've arrested our brothers, half the group, and they found the arms warehouse. So that was pretty significant. And then a short time later, Camayas replied to a caller regarding the same arrest, and it said, "Tell him to send me his passport. The stamps are all ready." And again, he was a proficient document forger, so we kept getting information that people were sending their documents to him, and he was forging copies or stamps. And then after that, Camayas actually called a man named Tariq Marouf, who was a key figure in the German case. And he told Marouf that you need to cover yourself now, and you know how. So that was all information. We were tying Camayas into the groups. At the same time, the safe house that we had mentioned earlier was providing very good intel. The INP had set up a lookout pretty close to the safe house down the street, but it was looking down into it at an angle. So we were able to really get some good photographs and video that led to some good surveillances. And we had really good equipment at the time, so we were able to get a lot of photographs. At the time, we didn't have a whole lot of them identified, but we were able to send copies to other organizations and other agencies. And little by little down the road, a number of those photos were identified based on these original photos from the lookout. Again, we were using a ton of TDY resources, and I mentioned earlier NCIS offered to assist us with additional translators, which we were appreciative of. And we briefed each other. They had a spin-off case that they were working with the Italian Carabinieri, which is a military branch that has policing duties as well. And down the road after the original arrests were made, the Carbs, along with the assistants from the NCIS, made another set of arrests. There are actually 3 sets of arrests down the road. So we're now at about the January-February time frame in 2001. And we thought the case was pretty solid. We had 16 subjects and identified in Italian cells that had ties to other European groups. We wanted to try to keep going with it, to see if we could, keep providing information to our counterparts and keep tying people in to the group, because there were a lot of phone calls, a lot of photographs that we hadn't identified.
Were you afraid, though, that as this cell continues to operate, that at some point they are going to go through with this attack?
Yeah, that absolutely, Jerry, and that was on everybody's mind. And in fact, in mid-March, everything changed. The investigation was really ramped up and intensified because of just that reason. A number of troubling overhears were picked up on one of the microphones, one of which was a conversation between Camayas and his group where he says, "I'd like to learn to use the drug and see the effect on someone breathing it, but the formula is in the hands of someone else." And then he goes on to say they've created a way to combine the fumes with the explosive, and the product is better, it's more efficient because, and I'm paraphrasing, but the liquid, as you can open it, it suffocates people. So that kind of changed everything. And in Italy, the prosecutors make a lot of the investigative decisions, and Stefano at that point said, "We're moving forward with the arrest." So the arrest took place, the original set of arrests took place in April 2001. And that was Camayas and 5 others who were arrested and charged with material support for terrorism. We did not recover any explosives in any of the searches. and some related terrorism charges. And remember, this was the investigation was all prior to 9/11. So post 9/11, the Italian laws changed drastically. So the penalties were much more harsh, much more stringent. But this case was grandfathered. So Kamaias received a 5-year sentence. The other 4 group members all received between 4.5, 5 years. Said, who was his contact and who brought him into Italy, escaped, but he was later killed by U.S. forces fighting in Tor Bor in Afghanistan towards the end of 2001. And the actual laws that the prosecutor won the case on were criminal association laws that were really designed for dealing with mafia cases. And again, all that changed, but this case was grandfathered, even though the conviction and the sentencing were in February of 2002. The case was grandfathered into the older laws. So Kamaias served his full 5-year sentence, and then was later deported to Tunisia to begin serving his sentence in absentia. He received 10 years. He only served a couple years of that, I believe, and then was released by the Tunisian government.
Do we know where he is now? I mean, is he still considered a threat?
I don't know, to be honest with you, Jerry. He started serving his sentence as soon as he was deported from Italy, and I believe he served a couple of years, and then there was a regime change in Tunisia, and the new government released him, and then I don't know after that. So there was a second wave of arrests later and towards the end of 2001, and then a third round in October of 2002. So there were a total of 15 arrests, 15 convictions, most within right around that 5-year range. And then Said was killed in fighting, who was the 16th indictment. A couple of things at the end. And in April of 2002, I traveled to Guantanamo Bay, the original Camp X-Ray. There were 7 or 8 North Africans who had spent time in Italy or were recruited in Italy that I went to talk to in order to try to get a little bit more of a picture of how the recruiting and the operations went in Italy and Europe. And lastly, after 9/11, we went back with the Italian National Police and pretty much scrubbed the entire investigation from top to bottom to see if there were any ties to the 9/11 attackers.
What'd you find out?
These groups were the original Al-Qaeda groups in Europe, kind of decentralized cells, but we didn't have any direct ties to the attackers. The Spanish thought they had identified one that was a possible in their investigation, but I don't know if that was ever confirmed. And the prosecutor's office and the Italian police said this was kind of the first time that they recognized the existence of European cells with strong ties to Afghanistan, and prior to that, the fighting in Chechnya. So a lot of these guys, we found that from the safe house, and the safe house was mainly used as an indoctrination center for new recruits, a place where the recruits went right before they traveled. And we know now that they traveled from Italy to Switzerland, and then from Switzerland to Pakistan, and later walked right across the border into Afghanistan, and prior to that, from Pakistan into Chechnya through some additional logistics. And so that's pretty much it.
Well, this is pretty fascinating. Could you, and we talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but could you just kind of go through what made this so different? Because I spent a lot of time talking about how TV and movies show the FBI conducting international investigations, and they make it seem so easy when in most cases it's really just a liaison function. Now I have to eat my words, because in this particular case, it was actual active investigation. Can you go over that a little bit more and tell us the significance of this case, and if there are other cases now, especially after 9/11, where we are working hand in hand with foreign governments in foreign countries on these type of terrorism or counterterrorism cases?
Sure. It happens more today than it did in the past. If we're invited in with a foreign police force or a foreign government, then we can certainly work the case with them. In this particular instance, we were deputized in the case specific. I mean, we couldn't receive that type of information on other cases. With the terrorism cases, though, a lot of times, the Bureau is asked for assistance, and we're ready to provide it. We're always ready to provide it. These cases cross borders. They're international. This case was a little bit of an example. In the early days, there were cells all over Europe, and when they would meet, they would all come together with all the heads of the cells, and there were 6, 7, sometimes 8, police forces involved in the surveillances and in the the debriefings. But yeah, the Bureau today is, especially extraterritorial cases. If there's a crime against an American and based on an act of terrorism, then if it's a friendly country, a lot of times the Bureau will come in and work with them. We did that in Khobar Towers in the late 90s. We did it at Dar es Salaam in Tanzania when the embassy was attacked. We worked. We had a whole group of investigators doing interviews and investigation hand in hand with the Tanzanian police forces, and it worked out well. They were actually outstanding. They didn't have the equipment or the resources that we had, but they were professional policemen and detectives, and we were able to really work well with them.
Can we then assume that, as far as France and what's going on in Belgium, that there is some type of involvement from the FBI in the United States in some of those investigations too?
Jerry, I would assume there's a lot of working together and sharing of information. Other than that, I really don't have the knowledge anymore as to how closely they're working. I would assume that they're sharing quite a bit of information.
I hope so.
Yeah, which is huge. I mean, it's there's always gaps in your investigations, and when you can meet with another, police force or intel service that can fill those gaps, and you can fill gaps for them, that's really important.
I guess this case and the successful outcome of it should give us all hope. That we do have a handle on this type of activity, and there are so many more instances. I take it where we have prevented an attack that most of us don't know anything about.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely accurate, and there's a lot of good work that's being done by the men and ladies out there. But it's an ongoing. Every day is a different scenario, a different group, and they're doing a great job. But it's a little bit scary, absolutely.
So where were you in September of 2001?
I was in the office in Rome at my desk, and it was we were 6 hours ahead, so it was just before 3:00 in the afternoon when I got a call from headquarters, and boy, that it's one of those times everybody remembers exactly where you were.
Absolutely. And so with you working these type of matters, actually actively trying to prevent bodily harm or harm to Americans in Italy, and then you hear that this has actually happened on American soil, and you are thousands of miles away, I can only imagine what was going through your head. Yeah,
it was an awful feeling, being so far away. But we went to work. The Italians were great. We met that evening, and we started going over case by case, subject by subject, individual by individual for weeks. And we had the help of the Italians. All the services at the embassy in Rome really came together nice. It was everybody had worked well. Our intelligence cousins, every piece of information that we could come up with, and we scrubbed our case as much as we could. Everything possible in that case we scrubbed. So we went to work right away as everybody else did, but it was a kind of a little bit of a helpless feeling seeing that back home, where you're from.
Is there anything else, in your career, especially again with what's happening, in France and Belgium, and how hard we're working here in the United States for the domestic terrorism and counterterrorism cases we're involved in. You've spent so much of your career devoted to that type of violation. Is there anything that you want to tell us about, or is there anything that you can think about that you'd like to add?
The extraterritorial cases, when I was working those cases, we heard good squad, good people, but you really get to see the victims. You're dealing with families, American families of victims, and it's that part of it you don't always get to see outside of working these type of cases, and it really kind of steels you to try to do a good job, and great support and good squad, and that was good work. But the type of cases you remember, and they were good cases to work because there was, you always remember there was that victim out there, the American victim.
So, John, what a fascinating career. And we didn't even talk about the organized crime and gang cases that you supervised.
Yeah, interesting cases, great investigators, great agents. The task forces are, I think are the best thing that, the Bureau's done, bringing all the talents from all these different agencies together and working together. It pulls everybody's strength. Some organizations are better at certain things. And, that concept with the JTTF, with the gang task forces, has been fantastic. Okay, so when did you retire?
I
retired in November of 2013. So I've been out going on 2.5 years, in a couple months.
And what have you been doing?
I work for a company in Camden, New Jersey called MAFCO Worldwide. And it's an interesting company. It's kind of a niche company. They began operations in 1850, and they've been in business continuously since then. So I do the compliance for the company, and company imports licorice root from along the 52nd parallel in Central Asia, and brings it back and in the factory in Camden, and we have locations in France and in China. It's an interesting job, and I'm really enjoying it.
So it sounds like, and not to take anything away from the job, but it sounds like you're sitting behind a desk a lot.
Actually, there's a lot of travel because I have responsibility for training our suppliers and our distributors and our commercial agents in Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the Office of Foreign Asset Control. Everybody says that, what do you miss? And you miss the people in the Bureau. They're probably the best people anywhere. So you do, I certainly miss the people, even though I'm enjoying the new job.
And that's the end of the interview. John Cosenza has had a fascinating career, and I'm so glad he was able to share a few of his cases with us. As always, I have photos of John at jerrywilliams.com, and I also have links to newspaper articles about the case he talked about working in Italy. Just want to give you an update on my review. I promised a couple of listeners that I would give my opinion on the show Quantico, what they had right and what they had wrong, with the understanding that it is a TV show and it is absolutely okay for them to be creative in making an entertaining production. I do want to make sure that listeners have information about what actually occurs at the FBI Academy. Not so much sex, I can tell you that. That blog post on Quantico, what they had right, what they had wrong, will be posted a few days after the season finale on May 15th. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again next week for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.